Mr. Tree was born in Taiwan. He grew up in Reston, Virginia, and he now lives in Washington, D.C. He's a graduate of Hampshire College and currently serves on the boards of Witness for Peace and the Andean Information Network. Sanho Tree believes that the drug war, drug policy, this whole study is one of the most interdisciplinary studies that you can find. One of these topics that you can come at from all different angles no matter what you're studying. And so we encourage you to think about how you might get engaged from whatever your particular interests are, or your major, or whatever your career aspects are, aspirations are. You can address drug policy in many different ways. It has both personal, local, and global impacts. And here is Mr. Sanho Tree to speak to us directly about these changing reforms.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you to Cara and Jake and Nick and SSDP. It's a real honor to be here, particularly since I was one of the original board members of Students for Science About Drug Policy when it was founded over a dozen years ago. It's really exploded across not only the United States, but internationally as well. So there's a big movement in Canada, there are European chapters, we have chapters in Africa as well. So this is a global movement now. The title of this talk is Kicking the Habit. And I think the people of Colorado, the voters, basically carried out an intervention with the US government. We have to talk. You drug warriors are addicted to $1.5 trillion so far in drug war funding by some estimates in my lifetime, fighting the war on drugs. You've got nothing to show for it. The outcomes are as bad as ever. Drugs are more plentiful, they're generally speaking cheaper than ever before, higher purity. These are the opposite directions that they said this policy was supposed to go in. And so it hasn't been working. But when the voters of Colorado and Washington State in 2012 sent that message to Washington, not only did it shake up Washington, it shook up the world. I don't know if you appreciate how much your votes reverberated across the globe. The State Department, was at a loss. How do you explain this to our international allies, or to whom we have been foisting this drug war, particularly in Latin America, for so many decades, adopting these really punitive and harsh measures? And these countries are asking the United States, our State Department, so now that your own voters are turning their backs on the drug war, you're going to change your policy, right, internationally? And they didn't have an answer. And for months and months and months, there was no comment. They were just absolutely silent, which is a good thing in itself. But they had to go within the administration. They had to turn to the Justice Department. Okay, what are we going to do about this domestically? Are we going to prosecute? Can we prosecute? Is it time to finally, allow some experimentation, etc.? And so they had to. It took over a year to craft this policy response. And it's not really a firm response. It's basically a bunch of executive measures that tolerate what's going on in this country. And the State Department is open to a flexible interpretation now of some of the international drug control treaties that the United States was primarily behind for many years. But this could all change with the next administration, with the stroke of a pen, though they'd be foolish to do it. But the momentum is definitely on the side of reform. So, since Washington and Colorado voted for this, Uruguay also voted in 2013 to legalize marijuana. So this is the first nation in the world to fully legalize and regulate and tax and control marijuana. People also think the Dutch did that, but the Dutch didn't properly legalize. They depenalized. They made it the lowest level of law enforcement priority, but it was still technically against the law on the books. They just weren't enforcing the law, unless you were causing other disturbances. So Uruguay became the first, and then last November, Oregon, Alaska, and Washington, D.C. also voted to legalize consumption and regulation of marijuana. Washington, D.C., my hometown, not the shoulder pride here, we have a restriction on our ballot measures in D.C. so that we can't implement a tax and regulate system or anything that would raise revenue or have budgetary implications. All we can do in a referendum in D.C. is to vote basically to legalize possession, home cultivation, and gifting And the city council, which supported this almost unanimously, which really surprised me, were prepared to have implementing legislation for a tax and regulate model. And this is where the Republicans, Tea Party in Congress in particular, stepped in and said, we're not going to allow this. And you might remember last month when they're having omnibus negotiations with the federal budget, they didn't have the votes to do it in public, it would have been an open debate, but one Tea Partier from Maryland, Representative Andy Harris, got an amendment through in a backdoor, closed room deal, the omnibus bill, and so it was a take it or leave it proposition. You reject the entire federal budget, or you get to vote for this thing. And so it passed. And what the Republicans did was say that you cannot spend, DC cannot spend any tax dollars to tax or regulate or in any way try to implement any kind of regulatory model for marijuana. Now, they did it in haste, they did it in secret, and they did it very stupidly, very clumsily. Because Congressman Andy Harris, he's not a libertarian, he's a social conservative. He hates any kind of liberalization of drug policies. And what he did, though, was basically give us a libertarian wet dream. So the ballot measure was self-enacting. That is to say, November 4th, when 70% of the voters of DC voted in favor of regulation and legalization of marijuana, that made marijuana legal in DC. And the proposition allows home growing, up to 6 plants, 3 of which will be mature, 2 ounces of possession, and you can gift an ounce, but you can't sell it. And so this is what the Congress, the Republican Congress, has left us with in DC, anarchy. We have legal pot and no way to regulate it. So thank you, Republican Party. I mean, this is really the most counterproductive thing I can think of. But the other thing I want to point out is that in Washington, D.C., this map, does anyone know what this is? What this map is about? There are 143 precincts in Washington, D.C. 142 voted in favor of this. Only 1 voted against marijuana legalization. It's one of the most affluent ones in Northwest Washington. And in that precinct, it lost by only 9 votes. That's astounding. That took me by surprise. And we knew we were going to win, but we had no idea we would win this big and this decisively. And this, I think, sends a signal to the rest of the country. And it's really hard to see how they're going to be able to oppose this. When you have a Republican Congress that believes in local rule, states' rights, local governance, for them to stand up and say, none of you voters in D.C. are able to vote for us or vote against us. We don't represent you, but we rule you. D.C., for many of you who don't know, is a colony, basically. It's a federal city. We don't have voting representatives in Congress. It is literally taxation without representation. We have a population bigger than Vermont and Wyoming, and we have no representation in Congress, and Congress can kick us around like a political football. And they've done it many times on abortion issues, on medical marijuana in 1998. But those days, I think, are coming to an end. And so, Oregon, Alaska, DC, and in 2016, the field was wide open. There are many different states working on initiatives. California, probably Nevada, probably Maine, Rhode Island. The state legislature might do this openly, with people standing up to be counted, represent politicians. That would be remarkable if it happened. Vermont is fast on its way to some form of regulation. The RAND Corporation, not exactly a liberal think tank, just came out with a big study last month on Vermont. And they showed many different ways you can impose a regulatory model on Vermont, or any other state for that matter. So the groundwork that you have laid out here in Colorado and in Washington State is really paying off. Other states are studying it, they're trying to learn from mistakes, and I know it's been a real burden in terms of regulatory compliance. It's been very costly for a lot of people, but you were the first to do it, so you had to do it right, or excessively perhaps. And then possibly New Hampshire, possibly Delaware, Maryland off in the distance. So other states are moving on this issue as well, and it's just a matter of time. Internationally, this is also sending shockwaves throughout this hemisphere. Chile, which historically has been very conservative with regard to drug policy, has now allowed medical marijuana, and they're now growing it. Uruguay, of course, voted to legalize and regulate. And the backlash from that has been very interesting. Uruguay is an interesting country because it never criminalized possession or personal possession or use of any illicit drug. And in fact, they codified this in the mid-70s through the Supreme Court. So if you're within a personal possession amount, you've been able to use drugs freely in Uruguay for many decades. And the only thing that changed with this new legislation is they wanted to regulate it, regulate cannabis for adult use, and keep the criminal element out of the black market, and to educate people and use the revenue for that. The response from the UN's International Narcotic Control Board, fortunately they have no enforcement powers, but they basically demanded that Uruguay reverse themselves. These are drug warriors hanging on to the last straw, basically. They're saying, no, 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 Uruguay, you cannot regulate marijuana. You must stop this and go back to the status quo ante, which is to say, give this economy back to the criminal market. These are drug warriors saying this, right? That just gives you a sense of how upside down this whole system has become. It's untenable. They can't continue this. Another thing to mention is that Uruguay, when they first came out with legalization, set a target price for $1 a gram. It would be state-grown marijuana. Whether they can actually meet those targets, they're still implementing it, remains to be seen. But it's important to keep in mind that we're talking about, when we talk about the war on drugs and the various substances, whether it's cocaine or heroin or cannabis, we're talking about minimally processed agricultural commodities that aren't terribly difficult to produce or grow. Certainly higher quality is going to fetch a higher price, just as you can go to your local liquor store and get a $2 bottle of wine or a $200 bottle of wine. Most people prefer the cheaper stuff, but there will still be a market for the more exotics varieties. But still, minimally processed agricultural commodities. So we're talking about heroin and cocaine. These things cost pennies per dose to manufacture. And yet when we hear about the incredible violence that's happening around the world, whether in Mexico or Colombia or Afghanistan, fighting over the war on drugs and the access to drug markets, they're fighting over the right to distribute these substances. They have very little worth in and of themselves. I made a video you can watch online called Shoveling Water a couple of years ago. It's on Vimeo. Just Google my name, Shoveling Water. It's a 20-minute video. And you can see how coca leaf is shot in the jungles of Colombia, where the farmers they grow the coca leaves, turn it into coca paste, which is the traffickers then refine the cocaine. It's a very simple, straightforward process. You don't need a high school diploma to do this. Peasant farmers do this kind of stuff. And it explains why they do it. And so all this violence is over access to markets. Who gets to sell these illicit substances, right? And that's one of the reasons that we, in the drug reform community, want to end drug prohibition, is that these people are murdering each other over the right to distribute these drugs. And it's the risk premium, because it's illegal, because we have a prohibitionist model, we end up creating an indirect price support for drug traffickers. We create these fortunes for these cartels. And the way it works is this. You can, the leaf cost of growing coca is fairly cheap. You can, once you process that into cocaine, you can buy a kilo of pure cocaine in the streets of Medellin, Colombia for maybe $1,500, give or take. It'll fluctuate from time to time, but roughly $1,500. By the time you smuggle that kilo to the streets of Denver or Washington or New York, and by the time the dealers take that kilo and they cut it up in little gram bags and dilute it with whatever garbage they're going to cut the drugs with to stretch their profits, they can get about $100,000 to $150,000 for that exact same kilogram. So what users are paying for on the street are essentially transportation costs, or more accurately, the risks associated with transportation. And this is the catch-22 of the drug war, why it's getting worse and worse every year. Our politicians respond to this kind of criminality and illegality by escalating law enforcement. And when they do that, they increase the risk premium to the drug traffickers. So the higher the chance a trafficker is going to get caught, or the longer the prison sentence they may have to serve, then the higher the premium they can charge the next person down the smuggling chain. So the more we amplify the drug war, we amplify the motivational feedback loop of the very people we're trying to stop. We keep making the drugs more valuable for them, which only draws more people into this market, causes all this violence, et cetera, et cetera. So if you were to ship that same kilogram from Colombia to Denver, it would cost you maybe $100 or so if you send it by DHL or FedEx. But because we have this incredibly difficult transit system with such high risk, people are able to charge tremendous amounts of money to do these things. In other countries, in the Caribbean, Jamaica is now looking at legalization of cannabis. I mean, people joke about that, I think Rastafarians, but Jamaica and a lot of Caribbean islands are socially fairly conservative, and they're pretty, they've been tough drug warriors for a long time. Dominican Republic, rumblings for reform there as well. Guatemala, very interestingly, the very conservative president, Perez Molina in Guatemala, former general and someone with a very sketchy human rights record himself, nonetheless has come out very strongly and very forcefully against the war on drugs. Its corrupting influences. He wants to see some kind of regulation. He's even talked about legalizing poppy production, which exists in Guatemala. In Colombia, one of our staunchest drug war allies historically, President Santos, himself a longtime critic of the drug war. People forget that he's been on record for since the late 90s anyway, being critical of the drug war, is now negotiating peace with the FARC guerrillas. This is a 50-year-old civil war. It's been going on as long as I've been alive, the civil war. And the guerrillas are actually maintaining their ceasefire. There might finally be some semblance of peace in Colombia. And the guerrillas are also talking about getting out of the drug trade. And so that's very encouraging. I mean, it's not going to make drugs go away. There'll be different criminal elements moving in, but as a major armed force, the guerrillas have to be dealt with. And it's good that they're making peace. And so, what you all did in November of 2012, I mean, you moved to Boulder. Boulder helped move a boulder, the boulder being the bureaucracy in Washington. The drug war bureaucracy does not move for anyone. We have tried. We in the advocacy community, we lobby, we pressure, we do this and that, and they move a little tiny bit. But when you voted to legalize in 2012, you sent them into a panic, and they had to completely accommodate. They had to completely change the way they did things. Rumbling all the way, but nonetheless, it's happening. And to give some credit as well to the drug war bureaucracy, the drug czar's office, I criticize them a lot, especially on international supply side issues and criminal justice part of things. But in terms of harm reduction, this administration has actually made a lot of progress, and they should be commended. They've been very good on overdose prevention, harm reduction, needle exchange, naloxone especially. They've been really strong proponents of naloxone, which is a drug that can basically reverse an opiate overdose, nasal spray, almost instantaneously. And it saved a number of lives. I believe it was an NSSDP member in Denver recently saved someone from an overdose. I mean, that's incredible. That's just, anyway, these tests are easily preventable, and there's no reason why we shouldn't have more of these policies throughout this country. There's another big change coming next year at the UN. There's going to be something called an UNGAS. UNGAS stands for United Nations General Assembly Special Session on Drugs. The last UNGAS they had on drug policy, they had on AIDS, they had on other subjects as well. But the last one on drugs was 1998. And back then, in '98, that was the year I started working in drug policy, they set a target of having a drug-free world in 10 years. Come 2008, they decided let's not have another meeting and look at where we failed and all this stuff. And they denied they ever declared that objective, even though it's in print and whatnot. But there's going to be a global meeting in New York in 2016, where the leaders and representatives from all the countries in the world are going to talk about drug policy reform. And so we're doing a lot of work on that, preparing. And for the first time, you're going to see a lot of splits. There's no longer a global consensus. There never was a global consensus on the drug war, in my opinion, but in terms of global governments, they all towed the line because they were afraid to step out and face reprisals from the US or other countries. But now, again, what the voters of Colorado and Washington State did was create a lot of political space for people around the world to push back and say, look, if U.S. citizens are turning their back on this. The U.S. government loses a lot of legitimacy in demanding these hardline policies. And the U.S. has traditionally been a very tough drug war nation. And now our ambassador in charge of the drug war is talking about flexible interpretations of treaties and that sort of thing. And they're becoming quite more tolerant, which is a remarkable achievement. And one of the cornerstones of the international war on drugs is the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotics. This is what just about all countries in the world are signatory to. It prohibits the legalization of illicit drugs. What Uruguay is doing is challenging that. They've been very critical of the United States allowing states to do this. And this treaty should be up for review. A lot of states don't want to re-examine the treaty. They want to keep it in place, but have a more flexible interpretation. Let's not rock the boat too much and open up a can of worms. And if you opened up that can of worms, it could go in either direction. You could get more reforms out of it, but on the other hand, Russia, a number of Asian countries, a number of Latin countries are going the opposite direction, clamping down and moving to the right. And so we might get some worse policies in that sense. But ultimately, we just may end up with regional blocks that if you travel in this hemisphere, you'll be a certain set of expectations with regard to drug policy. If you travel to the Middle East, it'll be probably much harsher. If you travel to Russia, forget it. And in a lot of Asian countries, reform is happening very, very slowly. And there's still a lot of awful policies, including executions, mass executions. But if you think about this, the 1961 treaties, what social norms from 1961 would we possibly tolerate today with regard to the way women were treated in 1961, the way African Americans were treated, people of color, indigenous people, LGBT people, right? Think of the movie Selma. Think of Mad Men. Imagine if a politician today gave a speech using the language of 1961. At best, they would have to apologize profusely and immediately. At worst, they'd have to resign in disgrace. We would not accept those kinds of social norms today. We have evolved, and through hard struggle, the women's movement and people of color and LGBT have achieved tremendous gains. And yet, when it comes to drug policy, when it comes to marijuana policy, most of these countries are saying, no, don't touch this. Leave it in place from 1961. Go back and look at some of the health education films. I mean, not quite Reefer Madness, but close. That was the state-of-the-art understanding. That was the conventional wisdom in 1961. And they're saying we should stay locked in that mindset. And I think that's a farce. No one can possibly say that with a straight face if you really look at, never even remember 1961. This one. Anyway, I'm very optimistic about change. It is possible that we will face setbacks if the Republicans take over the executive branch as well as Congress. Probably we'll see a lot of rollbacks. But within the GOP, there's a civil war already brewing between the social conservative wing of the party and libertarians. And so I think that presents some very interesting opportunities. I mean, it's fascinating because historically, accusing the other party of being soft on drugs, and Democrats used to do this towards Republicans. Tip O'Neill was famous in the mid-'80s. We thought that Democrats could out-tough the Republicans with the drug war, and that's how we ended up with mandatory minimums and all these horrible laws in the 80s. But historically, though, it's been the Republican Party that has used this rock. They've thrown it against usually liberals and Democrats, saying if you dare step out of line, you're going to be targeted as being soft on drugs, and it used to be considered a kiss of death politically, a third rail political issue. And this boomerang, it turned into a boomerang though. So the Republicans and Karl Rove and these political advisors are so used to using this soft on drugs attack, they throw this boomerang and it's now spinning back and dividing and hitting the GOP right in the middle, and it's splitting their own party now. Democrats are willing to let states experiment with policies, but the social conservatives want to roll that back, whereas the libertarians are saying, over our dead bodies. So it's going to be a really interesting run up to 2016 because you have an unmovable object of the Libertarians and an unstoppable force of the Tea Party colliding. And so whoever gets the nomination for the 2016 presidential race is going to end up very, very bloody from that fight, in my opinion. There are lots of wedge issues that are coming back to haunt them. And these are precisely the same wedge issues they used to use very effectively against Democrats. Which is very ironic. But in many ways, I think demographics is destiny. And that is to say that the modern drug war and culture war, and I think the drug war is very much part of the culture wars in this country, I think stem from the politics of the 1960s and the Vietnam War era. And where one stood on the Vietnam War often was an indicator of where one stood on other divisive social issues of the day, on interracial marriage or sexuality or drugs or rock and roll, counterculture, you name it. It divided this country in ways that were so profound, it continued to reverberate in our politics for a good 4 decades afterwards. And in many ways dominated our politics. It was decisive in our politics. It wasn't until recently I tried to put myself on the other side of this divide, the schism. What if, say, I were a white male World War II veteran, conservative, patriarchal, a little bit racist perhaps, and I played by the rules. This is the greatest country on earth. If you don't like it, go to Russia. And here come these kids in the 60s, burning the flag, spitting on American veterans, having sex all over the place, doing drugs, and being disrespectful to them. That damn long hair. How alienating, how bitter, how ugly would my reaction be? And it is something that Fox News especially has been able, and the right wing's been able to capitalize on for many, many years. And so they use these wedge issues politically, these cultural wedge issues, to basically hijack our politics in many ways. So that even up to 2004, the presidential elections, remember John Kerry, when he ran against George Bush, 2 major points that worked against him. One was not his stance on the Iraq War, which he opposed, but his alleged actions during the Vietnam War, where he got 3 Purple Hearts and yet was swift-boated, attacked by the Republicans as being a coward, while they were championing, George Bush, who served in the Texas National Guard and kept Texas safe from during the war. They made him the coward. And also in 2004, Karl Rove, Bush's advisor, helped get anti-gay marriage ballot initiatives in 11 states, many of them swing states, decisive states, and that helped turn out the vote. And so up until 2004, you still had presidential elections being swung by these culture war fissures from the 1960s that continue to reverberate. In many ways, I think Obama is our first post-culture war president, simply because he was too young to have taken sides in the 60s. But he still suffers from the reverberations of the cultural war, but he wasn't part of it himself. Right? But if you look at the demographics of Fox News viewers, they're typically extremely old, retired. If you look at the kinds of manufactured verses, the things that cause outrage and resonate on Fox News, those are the kinds of third-rail political issues of which the drug war historically has been one of them, that have been very effective politically, but are losing their resonance as the baby boomers and the greatest generation begin to recede from the political stage. Hopefully, they'll take their cultural war baggage with them. And there'll be new cultural war baggage. I think the political parties and campaigns have always looked for ways to find wedge issues to angry up the base, to get them to vote for or against something. Maybe it'll be the classic civilizations, but it won't be things like gay marriage. That is a dead issue, right? And gay marriage and marijuana policy, I think, are going kind of in lockstep. I mean, maybe it's a race, little ahead, little behind, and they switch places, but they're both moving very, very fast, faster than I expected, and they are indicative of things to come. And it's true that the Supreme Court is going to take up gay marriage. I think there are quite a few justices that would like to strike it down, but they can't. I think it's going to be very difficult for them to do that. And in both cases, we have something called the normative power of the actual. It exists. In so many states, people are getting married, right? In so many states, people do have access to both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. And if politicians and judges try to take that away from people, a right that people think they already have and know they have, then you're in for a fight. And if the justices try to do this through the courts, then at the highest court in the land, and the people continue to disobey them, their own legitimacy comes into question. They say they will listen to polls, but I'm sure they listen to polls. I mean, their own popularity is not great. So I think that's another avenue, another promising indicator. Historically, though, this is one of the things that has kept our drug war politics locked in place. It's a classic third rail issue. People know what third rail refers to? It's a DC term. It comes from the subway system. There are two rails that carry the train. The third one is high voltage. If you touch it, you're dead. You're electrocuted. And so politically, third rail issues have been things like gun control. Still is a third rail issue. It's a very live rail. Raising taxes, climate change, being soft on drugs, soft on crime, that's starting to deflate, and gay marriage is losing its polarity as a third rail issue. So it's an interesting moment politically to live through, to see the depolarization of a hot button issue like these. And it's still effective, though, in many ways, because as much progress as we have made on marijuana policy, politicians are nowhere near as willing to talk about other drugs. It's difficult to message and explain to voters, and even if they understand it themselves, it's not something that they feel comfortable talking about, and that voters will understand. One of the ways I use to illustrate this comes from one of my favorite popular philosophers. You've probably heard of him. Last name Simpson, first name Bartholomew. Bart Simpson runs for class president in one episode of The Simpsons. And he begins his campaign by attacking his opponent. And he says, "My opponent says there are no easy answers. Well, I say she's not looking hard enough." That's the problem in politics. That's the problem with Washington. That's why Fox News is so effective. That easy, people want easy answers. And very often, answers may be relatively easy, but the knee-jerk reaction is easier. Drugs are bad. Why not have a war on drugs? It's counterintuitive to think that, well, if you relax these policies, if you sometimes do the opposite, you'll get a better result. And so when I go to Capitol Hill and talk to staffers and members of Congress, I use this to illustrate counterintuitive solutions. That if you're caught in front of a TV camera and to explain to constituents why you voted for something controversial and complex, whip this out. Because the intuitive knee-jerk reaction to get out of a trap like this is to pull. But the harder you pull, the stucker you get. Right? And it's counterintuitive to think that, well, you need to relax and maybe even push in just a little bit, and that's how you extricate yourself. And so it's not impossible to message counterintuitive arguments, but it takes a little bit more patience and training, and you've got to hope that voters will understand and pay attention, so that historically what politicians have been afraid of are negative attack ads. Let's say Congresswoman Carol Councilman here represents Boulder, and or some other less liberal part of Colorado, let's say, and voted against Plan Columbia. And I'm a right-wing Tea Partier, and I want to challenge her. And I can run an ad very cheaply that does something like this. Friends, Congressman Councilman doesn't care if your kids are addicted to drugs. She knows where the drugs are coming from. They're coming from Columbia. The government there asked us, they begged us to help fight the war on drugs. She refused to send us aid. Come on, folks, we all know where the drugs are coming from. Send me to Washington, I'll approve this money. We'll go down there and clean up this mess, and I'll protect your kids. And Carol, if she's lucky, is going to have maybe 60 seconds on a 6 o'clock news to explain to all the voters who saw my negative smear ad air over and over and over again. And hopefully that the voters will also tune in and watch her 60 seconds and remember it at election time. And it's not impossible to defend yourself against these attacks, but it takes time and practice. And members of Congress and their staffs have about this much time over the course of the year to think about the issues that I work on that you're interested in. They have so many other issues to deal with. But you could flip the argument around. You could, if you communicate a paradigm shift in a soundbite, you've got traction in Washington. If you have to write a 100-page thesis, forget it, no one's going to read it. But you could say, Congressman could say, well, you know, sending guns and helicopters to Latin America isn't going to solve the problem of poverty in the Andes, and it's not going to solve the problem of addiction in the United States. That we can continue to hire more police and prosecutors and build more prisons to solve the drug problem, but that's about as effective as digging more graves to solve the international AIDS crisis. It really solves nothing. And we need to invest at home and give people opportunity, give people a reason to look forward tomorrow, to give them hope again, and that's the best way to keep people off of drugs, or keep them from addiction. And so it's not impossible to do, but it's difficult. It's not the obvious thing that comes to their minds. So they tend to run away from these issues. But that's changing with regard to marijuana policy now. And I also want to say that I don't believe that being soft on drugs is enough to cost any member of Congress their seats in and of itself, but that's not how they think. All right? They think in terms of what are the basket of liabilities we have going into re-election. We voted for cap and trade, we voted for Obamacare, we voted for this, we voted for gun control, we're going to throw drugs on this as well. How much of a gift do you want to give my opposition to challenge me? So that's the kind of calculus that goes on. But again, the equation is starting to change. And so the things that are left, blocking reform, the drug war bureaucracy. Again, by some estimates, $1.5 trillion since over the past half century we've wasted in the drug war. That's a lot of jobs, and it's an existential crisis for a lot of these bureaucrats and people in law enforcement. Those people work in nonprofit or work in academic departments. If your budget was on the line, you would move heaven and earth to make sure it was protected, and they're doing the same. Social conservatives, again, within both parties, but primarily the Republican Party, keep this in place. And in some cases, it's the growers themselves who want to keep prohibition in place. Because it's a good deal for them. They want a little bit of prohibition, but not too much. That is to say, when California had the opportunity to vote on Proposition 19 in 2010, which was an off-year election to legalize marijuana, they only got 46.5%, which was a respectable showing. But many of us said, don't do this in an off-year election, do this in a presidential year election, because young people don't turn out in midterm elections. But interestingly enough, the Emerald Triangle in California voted against Prop 19. They did not want legalization. They wanted a little liberalization, but they wanted that risk premium. As long as someone else got busted, that maintained a level of risk that justified them charging higher prices for the product. And this is something that we'll look out for in Colorado as well. I think the people have been talking about green rushes. You have these millionaires, Microsoft people, millionaires saying, oh, I'm going to become the king of pot, I'm going to invest all this money. And I talked to some friends in the industry, and I asked them, do any of these millionaire types, these investors, did they know anything about prohibition economics? Why pot is valuable? And they just laugh. All they do is look at, well, this is the current price of marijuana, and we can produce X, blah, blah, blah. We could have a huge profit. Well, those prices are propped up in many ways by the still existing risk premium. That technically, under federal law, most of the people involved in the marijuana industry in Colorado are still criminals. You probably won't be prosecuted, it'd be foolish of them to do it, but with a stroke of a pen, things can get a little uncomfortable for a lot of people. And so there is risk involved. Once that begins to disappear, then the justification of the risk premium also begins to disappear, and the prices start coming down. So I think it's kind of like the gold rush. I think the real money to be made is in the accessories. In the gold rush, is people who sold the tents and the blue jeans and the pickaxes and the shovels that really made a fortune, right? Not the miners themselves. Something to keep in mind. There will always be a market for high-grade cannabis, however. So, how do we deal with this problem? How can we accelerate this? How can we actually capitalize on this in more difficult states that aren't as open-minded? I think one of the ways to do this is it's kind of, again, profoundly counterintuitive, but I think we have too much accountability in politics in Washington. Now you're thinking I'm insane, but what I mean is that we now have a voting system where almost all votes now get registered and counted. It didn't used to be the case. Up until 1973, when the House of Representatives installed an electronic voting system, voting was a tedious process. And they didn't do a lot of roll call votes where they counted, you go every name and yay or nay, and record all that stuff. They did it if 1/5 of the quorum requested it, but it was so tedious that very few would do that unless it was a really important piece of legislation. Instead, they would do things like voice votes. They would do teller votes, they were called. There were 2 people standing in the back of the chamber, one for each side of the issue, yay or nay, and you would line up and you would walk past them, and they would count your head and your party affiliation, but not necessarily your name, right? And so you could cut deals, you could compromise. You could say, okay, I'm going to take one for the team. You know, this policy, even though my party supports it, you know, I have grandchildren, I care what kind of world they inherit. Let's clean up the environment. Let's do the right thing. I'll cross party lines. I'll compromise. Since 1973, with the introduction of electronic voting, those number of recorded votes starts to go up and up and up. In the 90s, it goes up, and now it's off the charts. And how many of you actually go to your representative's website to look at how they voted on issues? Almost nobody does that. Why? Right? Why are they recording all these votes? Again, it's counterintuitive. A lot of progressive groups think we should record every vote. It should be up there for everyone to see. Well, the people who really use that are advocacy groups. I use them to get a vote count and see where we need to apply pressure, etc. But primarily it's used by the opposing parties and by lobbyists to make sure they got their money's worth, make sure their politicians stay bought. But also, they set up a bunch of ambush votes, gotcha votes, to make the other party vote against something they like or whatever, to embarrass them in election time and say, oh, you voted, there might be a little bit of money within a huge bill to fund abortions in Africa. You voted to kill babies, that sort of thing. They take a little vote out of context and they smear you with it. And so that's that kind of voting. There's too much accountability. And so if you were today, let's say you're the House of Representatives, and I'd say, okay, let's see a show of hands. How many of you think it's time to tax and regulate marijuana, much like alcohol? 10 years ago, maybe you count on one hand the number of representatives who would be willing to stand up or raise their hand. Today, maybe 2 or 3 hands you could count them on. But on the other hand, if you said, okay, if I said, okay, everybody, put your head down on your desk, as you did in grammar school, and now raise your hand if you support that policy. No one else will see how you voted. You get a very profoundly different result, right? Why shouldn't we have the benefit of honesty in politics? Why shouldn't they be able to say what they really think is in the best interest of the nation, instead of playing party politics or worrying about gotcha politics and ambushes and things like that? And so there's one way to do this. And again, it's counterintuitive. Oscar Wilde once said, if you want someone to tell you the truth, give them a mask. What if we gave political representatives, either at the municipal, state, or federal level, a temporary mask, a veil of anonymity, a veil of conscience, where we can have a non-binding straw poll? Emphasize non-binding, I don't believe in making laws in secret. But as a procedural exercise, let's just have a secret ballot. And you can come out of the closet. No one else will know how you stood on this issue, not your party leadership, not the people who voted for you, not your campaign donors, lobbyists. No one would know, not the pressure groups. And for once in Congress, you can be honest. And if that result turns out that maybe 2/3 of Congress believes it's time to tax and regulate marijuana, when the aggregate number is released, again, no names, but when that aggregate number is released, it gives them some cover. And they can say, well, I'm being courageous by actually saying publicly what most of my colleagues believe privately. It's really time we tax and regulate it and change the paradigm of this policy. So it's not a guarantee of change, but it gives them some political cover and an ability to do that. And I think that's necessary for so many third-rail issues. We are literally running out of time on climate change, gun control, on infrastructure investment. We need to do a lot of these things. These are politically sensitive topics, and we need honesty, not more games being played in Washington. So that's one way to do it. Put another way, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg was talking about a different controversial issue domestically at the time, but he basically summed up. He said, look, we all know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. And so that's the problem we have to deal with now, I think, is to figure out how to get more honesty and integrity in politics. So that roughly is where things stand as I see it in terms of drug policy reform domestically, internationally. But again, this is one of the most interdisciplinary issues you could possibly hope to study. And so there's lots of different questions, I'm sure, from different angles and subjects we could touch on. I'd be happy to try to entertain some of them. Want to use the microphone?
Benefit of the crowd if you would come up and use the microphone, kind of like at the conference on world affairs. We won't say that students have to go first, but we encourage students to come up and ask questions. I'll put this off to the side here. I want to make two announcements. One is that there is a little thank you note going around. Is it back there? Good, it's coming around on this side. It's really nice for guest speakers to sort of hear maybe a little thing that you appreciated from the talk if you want to include a little note in the thank you note to Sanho. And the other thing is if you would like to continue the conversation with us, we're going to go over to the sink afterwards. And the benefit of the Global Studies wrap and the SSI wrap, the Sustainability wrap, we have added a little bit of funding for some appetizers if you would like to come, especially students, to come and continue the conversation with Sanho right after this presentation. So, questions?
I got a question if no one else has put on. How are you?
Good.
Hey, thanks for coming out. I appreciate it. Thanks for you guys putting this on. Can you hear me? You guys hear me okay?
Use the mic.
The question that I have, there's several, but the one I'll stick with is, and this is one thing that I grapple with all the time, as a world community member, we don't really have a model to base our decisions off of moving forward. Portugal has kind of really decriminalized drugs. Obviously, Amsterdam has a red light district. Crime rates are very high. The only claim that Portugal can make is that drug use hasn't increased dramatically. It's been largely stable. The country's bankrupt for several reasons, one of which some economists point to is that obviously it costs money to house inmates, but it also costs a significant amount of money to treat drug addicts. So I don't know what the cost-benefit analysis is on that, but the question is, in your mind, in my mind, I draw a distinction between, and maybe it's not right, I draw a distinction between alcohol and marijuana categorically, as opposed to dealing with harder substances that have much more addictive properties like cocaine, heroin, crystal meth. They have much more corrosive effects societally and even physiological effects, neurological effects. So I'm wondering, if you were to advocate, if you had a magic wand, would you advocate for legalizing, or I guess it's a two-part question. Would you advocate for legalizing all drugs or decriminalizing all drugs? And do you draw a distinction between what I view as less dangerous drugs like marijuana? Obviously, that should be legalized nationwide, similar to alcohol. But do you draw a distinction there? I guess that was kind of a long-winded question, but I appreciate you coming out. Very interesting.
Yes, I think it's a great question, and it's one that we don't really parse out too carefully in this country. And it's not good for our discourse, because people like simple answers, and they like simple options. It's not a Chinese menu we're dealing with here. It's not A or B. We follow these false dichotomies of black or white, legal or illegal. And legalization means different things to different people. The drug warriors have had many decades to basically create the connotation that legalization will lead is anarchy, it's free market, anything goes. And yet for those of us in drug policy reform, that's not what we have in mind when we talk about legalization. We talk about regulation, controlling, having more control over these substances, not less. And so it doesn't mean that if we decriminalize, which is what Portugal did, they did not legalize, they decriminalized. So it's still illegal to traffic, but that I think it's very common sense that if you believe that drugs cause harm to the individual, what sense does it make for the state to cause more harm through incarceration, through a penal system? You don't treat public health problems with coercion, for the most part. It just, imagine going to a psychiatrist for depression and they're going to treat you with a baseball bat. Smile and be happy or else. It's not the best way to approach the complicated problems. And so the Portuguese would not go back to the old model. They're basically their rates are. I think it's a successful experiment, and they waited 10 years before they went international to publicize this. And if you look at their use statistics relative to other EU nations, if you looked at it blind, you couldn't tell which one was Portugal. In fact, they had better outcomes in many ways because they didn't reallocate resources. But it's not legalization, and I think legalization. We should legalize personal possession or consumption. No one should be imprisoned or prosecuted simply for what they put into their body. They should be held, however, accountable for their conduct. If they cause harm to others or a nuisance or in any way infringe upon the rights of others, that's different. And society has a right to intervene. But I personally believe, and the Colombian Constitutional Court, as early as 1994, I believe, legalized personal consumption and possession of drugs because they have this idea of the sovereignty of the corpus, that somehow your body belongs to you, not to the state. Many European friends of mine are shocked by this. They just assume the state has these powers. Many of them grew up as subjects of monarchs and that sort of thing. But in this country we have a different tradition. And I think we need to save that and nurture it because the Fourth Amendment applies for so many in so many different ways. We have the USA Today had a big story yesterday about police having radars that can look into your house now. How long is it going to be before you see on YouTube, horizontal tango videos of police, shoving people in their homes? But if you don't have the right to do what you will with your own body in the privacy of your own home, if you're not harming anyone else, where does that power come from in our constitutional form of government? It's not enumerated anywhere. The assumption is that you have privacy of the home. Your home is your castle, and your body belongs to you. Your veins, your stomach, your brain belongs to you. And if the state is allowed to regulate what goes on inside your body, it's not too far of a stretch when you get into sexuality. In the state, we disapprove of this practice. You can't use this orifice for that function, etc., etc. It's a very slippery slope, in my opinion. And by making something legal to possess or use, to not punish, it's not the same as saying that heroin or methamphetamines or other drugs ought to be widely available or sold in government-sanctioned stores, that sort of thing. I think heroin should be, not methamphetamines necessarily, but heroin maintenance programs, I think, have a lot of potential, and they used to be very effective in England and in other countries until international pressure coming from guess which government made them stop many years ago. They're now revisiting them, and they're going back to looking at heroin maintenance programs or opiate, the heroin-assisted treatment or different maintenance system where the government provides heroin to an addict. When we talk about counterintuitive, I think it's a long way before the U.S. politicians are willing to talk about these issues, but bear with me for a moment. People's stereotypes of heroin addicts are that very often they're lethargic, they're lazy, they're drugged out. In fact, they're some of the most industrious people you'll ever meet. The problem is they only apply their industry to one thing under our system. Where's the next fix going to come from? They're terrified of going to withdrawal. And so all their mental space is taken up with the calculus of, okay, is the dealer going to be there? Do I have enough money? Do I need to turn some tricks? Do I need to steal something? If I steal it, where do I fence it? Is the stuff going to be any good? How do I, where can I shoot up? And immediately, they inject, and they're back on that treadmill. And so one of the things that the physicians have discovered in Europe and in Liverpool and other places, that if you provide a maintenance dose of heroin, that's to say you can't get more, that they get higher and higher, you can't chase the dragon, but you have enough to keep you from going into withdrawal, it opens up, surprisingly, a lot of mental space. for people to think about other things. So imagine, you know, a 24-year-old woman going to a doctor, the doctor says, I see what your problem is. The problem is you're a heroin addict. I'm going to give you a prescription. From now on, you take this to the chemist, the NHS, the National Healthcare System. It's paid for. It's pure pharmaceutical grade heroin. You can't share it with anyone. You can't get larger doses to keep getting higher, but you will not have to worry about withdrawal again. And suddenly, she's got time and mental space to think about other things. I've got a 4-year-old daughter, a 5-year-old son. Where have I been for their lives? I used to have a life. I don't particularly like this heroin anymore. It's a chemical ball and chain. It doesn't get me high, it just keeps me going to withdrawal. And it's a nuisance. I want to get my life back. And because they have a national health care system, the doctor that prescribes this can also get them into treatment right away. Contrast that with the system that we have in this country. When I started working in drug policy, I worked in East Baltimore. If you know the corner, the wire, those are the neighborhoods. And in that kind of a setting, in order for a heroin addict to give up drugs, they very often had to hit rock bottom. And unfortunately, that's our reality under our system. And by the time they hit bottom, they've destroyed their health, they've destroyed their families, their communities. If they're lucky, they haven't overdosed. If they're lucky, they haven't contracted HIV or hepatitis C. And if they're really lucky, they might be able to get a treatment slot for publicly financed treatment. And so you have to do all those things. You have to be really lucky to get to a point where you're willing to get clean again. Whereas in many of these heroin maintenance programs, they've been able to short-circuit that process and get people to voluntarily quit without having to go through all that. I'm not saying that's going to work in every case, but it's a different way of thinking about this problem, which I think we should open ourselves to counterintuitive ways to solve these problems.
That was a very intelligent response, yeah. I agree with most of those points.
Kind of a hard question to follow up. But the next question, I know drug policy is oftentimes kind of hard to talk about. So this question is about that, specifically with places like Texas and more conservative constituencies. I've heard a lot of rumors lately about particularly Texas with decriminalization and possibly running a full-scale campaign in 2016. I know with that, something that's been real successful is a safer message, marijuana being safer than alcohol. Just in general with drug policy, is there kind of an easy argument? I know you don't like easy answers, but something that is just kind of a safer message, similar to the marijuana safer than alcohol.
Yeah, you know, let's give conservatives credit where it's due. There's a good group called Right on Crime. I don't agree with them on everything, but on private prisons, for instance. But in terms of criminal justice policy and drug policy, they are pushing hard for reform. They have a number of prominent Republicans supporting them, including Texans. Even Newt Gingrich is a big supporter of theirs. They're saying it costs too much, it's counterproductive to incarcerate this many people, we got to rethink our criminal justice system. And so they're making headway. Texas, maybe time for decriminalization. I don't think legalization right away, certainly not in the immediate future. But other states in the South, conservative states, their legislatures have actually voted for medical marijuana. But CBD only versions of medical marijuana, the Charlotte's Web, that Sanjay Gupta popularized. It's problematic. It's a bad half measure, but it's for certain people it would be a beneficial thing. So that's progress. And the thing about Texas being a border state, though, many of them are facing a lot of the violence and spillover from Mexico and the drug war there, and their daily lives. I mean, they get to see things that perhaps express some of the futility. I mean, I think it's inchoate. They may not be able to express it quite the same way, but they're realizing things aren't working so well. And I'll give a little illustration of the history of interdiction and what we've done at the border, right? Stopping drugs. So we built the fence, number one. Great fence, right? My people built walls. Trust me, it doesn't work. As soon as they built this wall, the traffickers realized they could just pull up a truck with a ladder and have a ramp. You can drive over it. In other parts of the wall, you'll notice that there are 4-inch gaps in there, right? It's fine to stop humans from passing through, but the traffickers realized, well, let's take our drug packages and make them 3 3/4 inches wide, and literally pass them through the wall. Then they also went back to ancient technology, Hannibal's trebuchets, Roman technology, and so they literally fling it over the walls. A little bit more sophisticated, this is a modified version of a t-shirt cannon mounted in the back of a pickup truck. The pneumatic cannon to actually shoot the drugs over the wall for their accomplices on the other side. So right there. And then they also go underground, so they started building tunnels. We've discovered more than 100 of them now, some of them extremely sophisticated, with their own rail systems, electricity, ventilation, drainage, rails. I mean, they found one in Tijuana in 2012 that was almost completed when they raided it, and there was 40 tons of marijuana on the Mexican side waiting to come over. And once these tunnels are open, so you can run them 24/7, basically. They emerge in a warehouse on the U.S. side, and trucks come and go, and you can move lots of drugs and other things through those tunnels. And you can also move guns and ammunition and repatriate dollars through those tunnels as well, back the other way. The fracking industry has been a great contribution to this. So diagonal drilling, they found that you don't need to necessarily build tunnels for people to go through. You can have bore tunnels that are big enough for pneumatic packages to be shot through. So they can just drill without having this huge, more easily detectable hole. In the old days, they would use fishing boats to smuggle cocaine and heroin and marijuana into the U.S. They got better at inspecting those boats and stopping them. They switched to semi-submersibles. These are crude forms of submarines. They don't dive underwater, but 90% of it is underwater. They have a conning tower for air and navigation, and during the day they'll throw a blue tarp over themselves and lie still, and you can't see them. I mean, as one DEA agent said, you try finding a log floating in the Pacific Ocean, or try finding a Malaysian airliner. I mean, it's difficult. The oceans are huge. They really are. If you sail them, I've sailed across the Atlantic a couple of times. It's a big ocean, and so. But nonetheless, we got better at detecting these semi-submersibles. They're very low profile, but we can detect them. And so they moved into fully submersible, proper submarines. These cartels are building their own submarines out of fiberglass, out of Kevlar, they're carbon fiber. They're able to use materials that the US Navy can't use because they have very minimal needs. They need to dive maybe 50 feet at most underwater. They don't need to go super deep. They don't need to carry missiles. It's just a hollowed out shell for payload. And they need a little bit of ventilation. They don't have much ventilation. These things from under here smell like diesel and feces, basically. It's a very unpleasant trip, but with each sub you can move anywhere from 6 to 12 tons at a time. So when you think about, we intercepted a couple hundred kilos here or a dozen kilos there, until you're talking about tons, it's not really mattering a whole lot. And in fact, it's creating a price support, it's creating a risk premium, and you're actually helping the cartels by making these drugs more valuable. This is one of the more sophisticated subs they've discovered. And this has been going on for some time. I remember my first trip to Bogota in January 2001. They just recently discovered a fully submersible submarine being built by Russian engineers. The blueprints were in Russian. They fled the scene right before they raided it. And it was a proper submarine in Bogota. People know what Bogota is? It's in the middle of the freaking country, 8,000 feet high in the Andes. The chutzpah. They actually believed, and probably were right, that they had enough corruption to move a submarine to the ocean from Bogota. It's astounding. That's the periscope. Airplanes, they've also used airplanes in the past. So they used to use small planes, we got better at detecting them. They actually at one point used old airliners for one-way missions. You could crash the airliner on the other side and still make tremendous profit by the amounts they were able to smuggle. Then they switched to ultralights. It goes lower than the airplane, but over the wall. so it's under our radar. And they have these drop cages underneath them. They can hold a couple hundred pounds. They go over the wall. They see their accomplice. They lower. They pull the lever. The drop cage falls. The ropes go down, and the accomplices pick it up. They go back. That's one right there. They're actually dropping it. And I think this is the way of the future. Drones, unmanned aerial vehicles. You don't have a pilot to capture, no one to snitch. And you can run these things over and over again. In fact, it's already been done in prison yards. People have used drones to send in drugs, cell phones, and in a few cases guns using drones. So this is a really brave new world they've created. And the technology is spreading virally. Different countries are producing their own drones now, some of them quite sophisticated. So folks in Texas, they're kind of living in the front lines, and at some point they're going to realize, we've been doing this for a long time, and things only get worse. Anyway.
Good evening. Just wondering, say legislation did pass for legalization or decriminalization, do we have models set up to, are we going to follow Portugal's model? What types of things do we have set in place if these legislation were passed?
Yeah. So what models do we have to look to? And I think with so many problems, many of the solutions exist, but they exist as a mosaic. There are bits and pieces all over the world. There are best practices going on. And you can do this with transportation, environment, all kinds of different issues, right? If you piece it together, it's not so difficult to climb that mountain because you can adapt best practices. And so there are lots of harm reduction measures in various countries. In Vancouver, it's a really exciting city for drug policy reform. They had a very serious HIV problem and heroin problem in Vancouver. And over about a dozen years ago, they opened something called Insight. It was the first safe injections facility in North America, where the provincial government and city government encouraged, allowed, tolerated, experimented with the 4 pillars approach. They call it the first you prevent, if you can. You educate and prevent drug use. You provide treatment for those who want it. For those who aren't ready to give up or to receive treatment, you provide harm reduction. Clean needles. You have a supervised injection site. Insight is a remarkable place. It's a pristine, it's a clean environment. They have lots of booths. People can go and clean their injection equipment. There's a doctor or a nurse on premises in case of overdose. So they used to have an annual overdose. I think the peak it was like 17 overdoses a year. They dropped it to 0, basically, and basically halted the HIV transmission intravenously. So a lot of great outcomes. I helped the mayor of Vancouver, Philip Owen, at the time, a courageous conservative, implement this. He asked me when I visited there in 2002 to lobby the Chinatown business community because it was their neighborhood where they're going to build this site. It was the downtown east side of Vancouver. And they were furious. Chinatown businesses, like, how come it's the minorities? How come it's us? We get crapped on all the time, and now you want to build this thing for junkies in our neighborhood, our doorstep? We got enough problems. You got needles everywhere, you got all this stuff. People are overdosing. Why do you want to do this? And so the mayor asked me, maybe you don't speak Cantonese, but could you go talk to them anyway? And I did, and others did as well. And they are now the biggest supporters of Insight and of harm reduction. Their property values increased. Their streets got cleaned up. People, stopped fighting each other. They started taking. It's a totally different vibe now in downtown east side of Vancouver. And now, not only are they offering a safe injection site, but they're actually moving forward with heroin maintenance. That'll be the first in North America. So that's very exciting as well. Meanwhile, the rest of the Canadian government, especially the federal government under Harper, is going in the other direction. It's kind of like Bush with a brain. So Canada's an interesting place to look at. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
One more question, and then Kara, and then that'll be
So I guess similar to medical marijuana, do you have any thoughts on introducing policies regarding psychedelic assisted therapy
That's a great question. There's a lot of really exciting research going on in terms of, and unfortunately it's a result of all the wars we've had for so many years now. We have so many veterans with severe trauma and PTSD in particular. And so the organization called MAPS,
Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
They do terrific work. And they've been pushing the DEA, and they actually got the DEA to agree to a lot of this stuff, to have they can now study PTSD with ecstasy and DMA, the treatment. They found that other research ketamine, Special K, the animal tranquilizer, the party drug, actually has profound implications for severe depression. And I have friends who've suffered from really severe depression. In the 90s, one of my best friends had 40 or 50 ECT shock treatments, because that conventionally was the only thing that could lift you out of a suicidal state of depression. And the side effects, basically he has no memory of those 10 years. And it's just a very traumatic and hard thing to watch and endure, but it saved his life. They found with ketamine, within hours of administering, they were able to pull those people out of severe depression. I mean, that is exciting stuff. There's things that are going on psilocybin, magic mushrooms. They're doing studies now, government-authorized studies of end-of-life treatment for cancer patients, for instance. It's helping them come to terms in ways that they haven't been able to do in the past. So that's a really interesting front. We suffered a lot of setback as a result of the 60s and the backlash against this. But now we're finally going back and looking at these drugs, many of which were developed initially for use in psychiatry. They just got abused along the way, but now we're able to go back and properly study many of these substances. So that's a really exciting front. I think there's a lot of potential there. Thank you.
And this question is for all of us to think about, and hopefully for you to give us a little insight, although I'm sure you won't be able to fully answer. And that is, what can we all do as members of our community to reduce the harm on the overall level? Can we encourage our politicians? Should we be working to engage the community? How should we be trying to affect change positively on our level here in Boulder?
Oh, that's a great question. And I offer workshops on this, so I'm going to give you a very condensed version of this. But history is made by those who show up. If you sit at home, watch TV, sit on your couch, and forward email petition, probably not much is going to happen. But if you take the time to get involved and communicate with your representatives and run for office yourselves, and to vote with your feet, volunteer. Some of my European friends look down on volunteerism. Because they said, you're depriving someone of the job. I said, what do you mean? And it took me a while to figure it out. In these Scandinavian social democratic countries, if hundreds of people gave up their weekends to help homeless people, to volunteer, I volunteered for 10 years at Good Walker Clinic in Washington, D.C., which is one of the largest aid service providers. When that many people volunteer with their labor and their time, that's a signal to politicians. This is a social need that's not being met. And people shouldn't have to give up their weekends to do this. We're voting with our labors that we want this stuff funded. It's important to us. When's the last time you saw people give up their weekends to go build an aircraft carrier or have a bake sale to fund an aircraft carrier? They expect that kind of funding. And we should expect the same for the issues that we think are important. And if you don't communicate with your representatives, they have no way of knowing. It's too expensive for them to commission polls on every subject they have to vote on. And so the people who make the noise get the attention. And they extrapolate, given how many calls or letters or faxes or visits they've received, then they think, oh well, that represents X number more people who are concerned about these issues. And so the NRA is very good on this, and they're noisy and they're active. And that's why they get so much response from Congress. And until we learn to do that with our issues, there's no way for them to know. Letters to the editor, I mean, that's a really important, and it's the most widely read section of local newspapers, and politicians read it. And when your politicians do the right thing, it's important to thank them, because you think about this, you know, we think of them as corrupt, and some of them are, but when they want to raise all that money for campaign ads and stuff, the ads are for the purpose of making them look good, of good publicity. But if you are willing to take your time to express to your peers in your community, in your workplace, in your schools, you know, I think this person is good, they did the right thing, I support that. That's the kind of publicity they can't buy. They can't even hope to buy that. And so once you do that, you can establish a relationship. They take you seriously. You know, you put up or shut up, and you're willing to put up, and that's great. And that's how you get leverage with politicians and hold your representatives accountable. So I encourage in all fronts to just get involved with organizations, do it your own way, experiment with your own methods, but get involved. And finally, I'll just point out there are a couple of articles I've put in back there and other literature. Please help yourself on the way out. Thank you very much.